Welcome to part 4 of this series on shorebird plumage and molt. And in this video we will be looking at formative plumage. So things that I hope you will take away from this video are that you will understand some of the characteristics of preformative molt and the plumage which results from it, which is formative plumage, and that you'll be able to use that information to help you to identify formative plumage in a variety of species in the field. As I mentioned in previous videos, I'm mainly focusing on migratory shorebirds which occur in Malaysia, although some of the things that I share may be true also in other areas. I also mentioned that this is part 4 of a series on molt, and I will include links to the earlier videos as well as some other useful resources in the comments below this video. I'd like to start with a personal disclaimer, and that is that I'm not an expert on molt. I'm learning, and in fact this series of videos has been a very helpful exercise for me to grow in my understanding of molt. And so I don't claim to be an expert, but I am interested in learning and also in sharing what I'm learning. And so that's what I'm doing with these videos. As I'm learning, I'm discovering that molt is highly complex. At the beginning of this series, I said that I wanted to try and keep them as simple as possible, but that's become increasingly difficult as I learn more about molt. And in that regard, I would thoroughly recommend some more resources, and chief among them is the book which is pictured on the left here by Peter Pyle. It's The Identification Guide to North American Birds Part 2, which covers alcids and other non-passerines, in particular shorebirds. And I want to give a shout out to Peter Pyle, who is an expert on molt and who has been incredibly helpful and generous with his expertise and with his time in helping me to grapple with some of the more complicated aspects of molt. And so I do recommend this book very highly. And also there are increasingly a number of very helpful videos and webinars recorded on YouTube. And I'll give some links to some of the ones that I found particularly helpful in the comments under this video. So if you feel that this video is a little bit too advanced for you and you want to have something a bit more basic or more of a primer, then hopefully some of those links will help you. So that's my disclaimer, and now I want to give you an outline of this presentation, and I hope I won't put you off right at the beginning, because you will see that it is quite extensive. So we're going to start off by reviewing the shorebird molt cycle, which we covered in the first of this series. And then we're going to briefly touch on molt strategies. After that, we'll look at general characteristics of formative plumage and ask the question, or try to address the question, why do birds have a preformative molt? Why do they have a formative plumage? And then, when is the best time to see preformative molt or formative plumage? And what determines the extent of the molt? So as we will learn, different birds have more or less extensive molt in terms of the number of feathers which they change during this molt. And what determines that? We'll look at that. And then we'll get into some of the details. So preformative molt in the complex alternate strategy, I'll explain what that is. Which feathers are replaced in the complex alternate strategy, northern hemisphere strategy, and how to spot those between the months of August and December in the field. And then which feathers are replaced in the complex alternate strategy, southern hemisphere strategy, and how to spot that between the months of December and June and beyond. And then which species exhibit the complex alternate strategy. Then we'll look at preformative molt in the simple alternate strategy and which feathers are replaced in the Northern Hemisphere strategy of the simple alternate strategy, SAS, how to spot that between the months of August and December in the field, how to spot it in between the months of December and June, and then looking at the Southern Hemisphere strategy for SAS and how to spot that between August and December and June and beyond. And finally, which species exhibit the simple alternate strategy. So I hope that I've not put you off already, and I hope that as we go through this step by step, you will be able to grasp the different terms and the different distinctions between various strategies. So first of all, let's have a brief review of the shorebird molt cycle. In the definitive or adult cycle, adult shorebirds in Malaysia have 2 plumages per cycle. That is the basic plumage, which is attained by pre-basic molt, and then the alternate plumage, which is attained by pre-alternate molt. That's the adult cycle. So in the case of Northern Hemisphere breeding shorebirds which migrate through Malaysia, pre-basic molt normally occurs after breeding, and alternate or pre-alternate molt occurs before or during northward migration. In the first cycle of a bird's life, and only in the first cycle, most shorebird species have an additional molt between their first basic plumage, i.e. the juvenile plumage, and their first alternate plumage. If we have a look at this diagram here of the first cycle of a shorebird's life, which is from the first of this 4-part series, then you will see formative plumage is the plumage which occurs between juvenile plumage and first alternate plumage in most shorebirds. I've just put a circle around it here in red, and of course after the first cycle the bird will go on to pursue the adult cycle or definitive cycle in which there is no formative plumage. So this is a once in a lifetime plumage that we'll be looking at in this video. Before we get into the detail of preformative molt, it's necessary for me to touch on molt strategies, and I hope you can bear with me because this is a little complex, but fortunately we won't need to look at all of these in detail. So all birds exhibit one of 4 molt strategies, and it's a combination of basic and alternate and simple and complex. So the simple basic strategy, or SBS, is 1 molt per definitive or adult cycle, which is the pre-basic molt leading to basic plumage, and no additional molts in the first cycle. So that would be a bird that has juvenile plumage and then goes throughout the whole first cycle, and then the next cycle it starts with basic plumage and no other molts. That's the simplest of all the strategies. Then complex basic strategy, which is 1 molt per adult cycle, again the pre-basic molt leading to basic plumage, but 1 additional molt in the first cycle, which is the preformative molt leading to formative plumage. So only in the first cycle there is formative plumage, and then once they reach adult or the definitive cycle, they just have 1 molt per cycle. So that's the complex basic strategy. The third one is the simple alternate strategy, and that is 1 additional molt in the adult cycle, which is the pre-alternate molt leading to alternate plumage, and one additional molt in the first cycle as well, which could be pre-formative molt or it could be pre-alternate molt, but not both. So simple alternate strategy, one additional molt in the adult cycle and one additional molt in the first cycle. And then the complex alternate strategy, one additional molt in the definitive cycle, the adult cycle, which is pre-alternate, but then two additional molts in the first cycle. And so that would be pre-formative molt and pre-alternate molt. Fortunately, migratory shorebirds in Malaysia only exhibit two of these strategies, as far as I know, and they are the simple alternate strategy and the complex alternate strategy. And I'll show you again what these look like. So in the first cycle, first of all, we'll look at birds that have separate formative and alternate plumages. So that's the complex alternate strategy. So in this cycle here, you can see there is pre-formative molt circled in red, leading to formative plumage, and then pre-alternate molt circled in yellow, leading to first alternate plumage. And that's the complex alternate strategy. So we'll be looking at pre-formative molt in birds that have the CAS, complex alternate strategy, first. And then we'll look at some species which only have pre-formative molt in the first cycle, which is the simple alternate strategy. And that looks like this. So from juvenile plumage, they have a pre-formative molt, which is normally rather protracted and lengthy and results in formative plumage, but there is no alternate plumage in the first cycle. So they then go into the definitive cycle. Okay, so we've looked at the two main molt strategies which shorebirds in Malaysia use. Let's now look at some characteristics of formative plumage as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, it's a once-in-a-lifetime plumage. Sometimes people call it the teenage plumage because it only occurs when the bird is in its first year of life. It's attained by preformative molt, which replaces a variable number of juvenile feathers. And I've used an example here of a marsh sandpiper because marsh sandpipers have very distinctly patterned juvenile feathers. You can see all the wing coverts on this bird are juvenile feathers with rather dark centers and neat pale fringes. But the formative feathers are sort of evenly grey. So you can see that the scapulars on this bird and some of the inner median and greater coverts are in formative plumage, and the majority of the wing coverts are in juvenile plumage. So preformative molt replaces a variable number of juvenile feathers. It's partial in most species. It includes the head and body, a variable number of wing coverts and tertials, and sometimes flight feathers as well, and I'll talk about that later. So by flight feathers we mean primaries, secondaries, and tail feathers and tertials. So but basically primaries, secondaries, and tail feathers. So those are some characteristics of formative plumage as a whole. Why do some birds, many birds, have a preformative molt? Well, casting our minds back to the previous video in this series on juvenile plumage, one of the things that we said was that juvenile feathers are relatively poor quality, and the reason for that is they have to be grown quickly. Chicks, when they are newly hatched, are in a very vulnerable situation before they can fly, and so it's obviously in their best interests to grow feathers as fast as possible. And the trade-off for the rapidity of that process is that those feathers are not strong, and so preformative molt gives them a chance to replace those feathers, or some of them at least, with much stronger, more durable ones very soon after fledging. So in this example, this Malaysian plover, which I watched from day one when it hatched, was approximately 14 and a half weeks old when I took this photograph, and it's already in preformative molt. So that's just 3 months after hatching, more or less. When is the best time to see preformative molt? Well, it starts within a few weeks of the completion of first basic or pre-juvenile molt. In fact, in button quails, it may even start before the completion of pre-juvenile molt. And in migratory species in Malaysia, we can start seeing preformative molt from around August on into the following year, into February and beyond, up until June, July, if the birds hang around in the summer, in the northern summer. It's important to recognize that some species or some individuals of species undergo or start their preformative molt in Malaysia. So they arrive here as in juvenile plumage and then they begin their preformative molt, while others have already begun their preformative molt before they arrive in Malaysia, and some may have already even completed their preformative molt before they arrive in Malaysia. And in those cases, we would rarely see birds in juvenile plumage here because they've already molted, they've already completed their preformative molt. So we mentioned that preformative molt is variable in extent. Some birds just molt body and wing covert feathers, while others also molt flight feathers. So what determines the extent of preformative molt? And it seems to be the case that it's not just variable between species, but it's even between individuals of the same species. And the factor that seems to be influential is how far south the bird spends the non-breeding season. So just to give you a simple example, here's two maps of the non-breeding distribution of two shorebirds. You can see the equator there running right the way just south of Malaysia. And the yellow is the wintering range of two species, which are similar in appearance and size. On the left is the dunlin, which is very rare in Malaysia. And on the right is curlew sandpiper, which spends the non-breeding season right the way down to as far as Australia. So in general, the further south the individual or the species spends the non-breeding season, the more extensive the extent of preformative molt. So birds which spend a non-breeding season in the northern hemisphere or near the equator tend not to renew flight feathers in preformative molt, and this is sometimes called the northern hemisphere molt strategy. And so this little diagram here shows you the feathers in pink are formative feathers. The feathers in kind of straw color are juvenile feathers. So you can see that there is not much, the preformative molt is not particularly extensive in the northern hemisphere preformative strategy. And the reason for this is thought to be the fact that in the northern hemisphere, or certainly not in the southern hemisphere, if this may be linked to fewer daylight hours and therefore fewer or less opportunity to forage, less prey, less energy to fuel a more complete molt. In the southward migratory season in Malaysia, most first cycle birds exhibit a partial or incomplete preformative molt, and they don't usually replace the flight feathers. And I'll give you an example of that. The marsh sandpiper here. So on the left, you can see an adult, and on the right, a first cycle bird in formative plumage, and it has retained its many of its juvenile wing coverts, replaced its scapulars and some inner, median and greater coverts. So now we're going to look at preformative molt in the complex alternate strategy. Remember that the complex alternate strategy, the CAS, has two distinct additional molts in the first cycle, preformative molt and then pre-alternate molt. So birds with CAS have separate preformative and pre-alternate molts. And preformative molt tends to be finished quite fast, typically between August and December, and to be limited or partial in extent, usually not including many flight feathers. So which feathers are replaced? Let's again look at marsh sandpiper as an example. Here is a marsh sandpiper photographed on the 9th of August, and we can see on this bird, this one's taken on the 27th of August, that there are just a few formative feathers among the scapulars there. You can see the ones I've picked out in pink, but actually on the bird they're a plain grey as opposed to the patterned juvenile feathers. So this is 27th of August. Here's another bird, and you can see on this one pretty much all the scapulars have been replaced. So the scapulars are in formative plumage. And notice also that the wing coverts, the juvenile wing coverts, this is taken toward the end of October, are particularly worn and abraded. And I've just shown that on this diagram by making those coverts paler, and that just signifies that they're more worn. So in this case, this bird has only molted its scapulars into formative plumage. On this one, which I showed you a little earlier, there are also some inner median coverts, which you can see on the diagram there, which are, if you look at the actual bird, they're sort of plain grey with a thin white edge, as opposed to the juvenile coverts, which are blackish with a thin buffish edge. So generally speaking, in the complex alternate strategy, in birds that are using a Northern Hemisphere strategy, they replace body feathers and a variable number of coverts and tertials. So how do we spot formative plumage in the complex alternate strategy, Northern Hemisphere strategy, between August and December? Here's a small flock of marsh sandpipers again at the end of October. Hopefully you can see one of them is different, although in appearance they do look quite similar to adults. And the key things to look for are molt limits or contrasts between generations of newer and older feathers. And this could be within one feather tract, or it could be between feather tracts. And also it's important to look for juvenile feathers, especially the flight feathers, the tertials, and the wing coverts. So blowing up this individual, so hopefully you saw it was the bird in the top left. And what we can see here is a contrast between these outer median coverts and the inner median coverts. So the inner median coverts have been molted. They are formative feathers. The outer median coverts have not been molted, and they are juvenile feathers. So there's a molt contrast or a molt limit in the median coverts here. We can also see a contrast between tracts of feathers. So the greater coverts on this bird are juvenile feathers. The scapulars are formative feathers. And lastly, we can see that the flight feathers are uniformly aged and uniformly worn. They are all juvenile feathers. There's no molt in the wing, in the flight feathers. What about the complex alternate strategy, Southern Hemisphere strategy? So birds like this pectoral sandpiper, which I photographed in Australia, and which winters in Australia, or spends the northern winter, the non-breeding season in Australia. This follows a Southern Hemisphere strategy, and the preformative molt may continue, resulting in partial or complete replacement of flight feathers. So it's more extensive. And again, this is thought to be linked to the fact that there's more daylight hours and more prey resources, enabling them to have extra energy to undergo a more complete molt. So this is called the Southern Hemisphere molt strategy. Let me give you a couple of examples of the sequence of feather replacement. This is from Peter Pyle's book, which I mentioned earlier. So the top one, A, we can see that the formative feathers, the flight feathers, are molted in what we call a typical sequence. That is, from the innermost primary outwards and from the outermost secondary inwards. And so that's called the typical sequence. But in B, this is what's known as an eccentric sequence, where molt begins with the outer primaries and moves outward, and sometimes it occurs in the middle or the inner secondaries, and it can move both inward and outward from that starting point. But generally, I think I'm right in saying generally it'll move inward toward the body. So here's an example of an eccentric molt sequence. Preformative molt is more protracted in this Southern Hemisphere strategy and generally starts later because there's not so much of a time crunch. And it can actually overlap the subsequent molt, which is the pre-alternate molt, which is, we can see here the pale green feathers. That's the beginning of pre-alternate molt. So preformative molt is still ongoing as preformative molt begins. And in fact, it can even still be ongoing when second pre-basic molt begins. So here's an example of feathers being replaced in typical flight feather replacement sequence in preformative molt. This is a picture which I took relatively recently on the 1st of April this year, and I'm quite proud of this picture because it shows two races of black-tailed godwit. The lower one is the Bohai race, and the upper one is the Melaniroides race, and both of these birds are in preformative molt of their flight feathers. And what we can see here is that the lower bird has replaced its inner 5 or so primaries, and also, if I'm right in just looking on the screen, some outer secondaries, and the upper bird, which is the Melaniroides godwit, has started from the innermost primary as well. So this is flight feather replacement in typical sequence. So we can see the juvenile feathers, which are much more worn and more pale, bleached. And then the preformative feathers, which I've colored in pink, which are darker and fresher. So this is primaries 1 to 5 and secondaries 1 to 3 on the top bird. On the bottom bird, all the secondaries, I beg your pardon, are juvenile feathers, as well as the outer primaries. And primaries 1 to 5 have been replaced in typical sequence. Another example is this Oriental pratincoal. Oriental pratincoals, as far as I know, are unique among shorebirds in Malaysia in that they undergo a complete preformative molt before they leave the country, before they leave Malaysia after breeding. It's a very rapid molt. So this bird likely hatched in May. It was in full juvenile plumage, began molt in July, and by November it will have completed its preformative molt, and it will then be indistinguishable from adults. It will have completely replaced all its flight feathers, all its coverts, all its body feathers. And so if there are no more juvenile feathers on the bird, we won't be able to age it. We won't be able to tell if it's a first cycle bird or above. So we may ask the question, why is it that Oriental pratincoles have this complete rapid preformative molt? And if we consider that these birds are going to migrate southwards from Malaysia after breeding, then they're going to be spending a lot of time in intense sunlight. So they breed in very arid, hot conditions, and they will migrate down into northern Australia, where it's extremely hot in the Austral summer. And so they will spend many hours in intense sunlight. And given that UV light is the main cause of feather damage, and also that pratincoles are aerial feeders that depend on their flight feathers to catch prey, then maybe it's not so surprising that this species undergoes a complete and rapid preformative molt. So again, they replace their primaries and secondaries in a typical sequence. In this case, starting from the innermost primary moving outwards, and then the outermost and another point somewhere in the middle of the secondary. So 2 nodes where secondary molt has begun. What about the eccentric flight feather replacement sequence? So here's a marsh sandpiper again, and what we can see here is that it is replacing its outermost primaries. So this was pattern B, which I showed you earlier, where the flight feather molt begins at the outermost, or toward the outermost primary feathers. Here's another bird which has replaced its outermost 2 primaries on the near wing, maybe just the 1 on the far wing. You can see that those 2 feathers, the 2 longest primaries, are newer and fresher than the ones further inside or further into the wing, nearer to the body. And we can also see that this bird has begun first pre-alternate molt, and some of the median coverts and some of the scapulars have been replaced as well. So this is a case where this is a bird that was photographed in April, so still in preformative molt, and pre-alternate molt has begun as well. Another example, this one, redneck stint, in preformative molt at the end of April. So this bird has molted its outer primaries and also some of its inner secondaries eccentrically. So I've just pointed that out. It's difficult to see them because they're almost covered. They're the inner secondaries as well as the 2 outermost primaries. So here's another example of a bird replacing its flight feathers eccentrically. So this is the Southern Hemisphere preformative molt strategy. So how can we spot complex alternate strategy, formative plumage, Southern Hemisphere strategy between December and June and beyond? So normally the flight feather replacement does not begin until around December. So it's usually not possible to see this in Malaysia until around the middle of the northern winter. So here's an example of 2 pteric sandpipers taken on the 26th of December, and the bird on the right is in preformative molt, and you can see that the second to outermost primary has been replaced, and the very outermost primary is not yet replaced. So this is an active preformative eccentric primary molt. So if you find a bird that has the outermost primaries fresher than the inner primaries, that's a good sign that you're looking at a bird in preformative molt following a southern hemisphere strategy. And sometimes also inner secondaries and some tail feathers can be replaced as well. So the same bird again on the right. You can see this is a view of the upper wing. And also, sometimes with these birds, because they're replacing some median coverts, it can create a pale mid-wing panel of fresher feathers. So that's another sign of a bird in preformative molt in between December and early in the year. However, by this time, it's probably impossible to separate or to age pratincoles. What about even later in the second calendar year? Here's an example of a marsh sandpiper that was photographed in September. And this is a bird in its second cycle. And it can be aged by the presence of formative, basic, second basic, and juvenile feathers in the same wing. So here's a diagram. The blue feathers are the basic feathers, pink are the formative, and those little spikes on the inner secondaries are all that's left of the juvenile secondaries. So here they are, juvenile feathers. So these would now be more than a year old. And then formative feathers that would have been molted sometime probably early in the year. And then its second pre-basic molt is underway, where it is moving into its, eventually that pre-basic molt will replace both the juvenile secondaries and the formative outer primaries. So which species exhibit the complex alternate strategy? Actually, many. Most small to medium-sized migratory shorebirds exhibit the complex alternate strategy with distinct preformative and pre-alternate molts. And in extent, the preformative molt may be limited with some but not all body feathers and no flight feathers replaced, or partial, where most or all body feathers and no flight feathers are replaced except perhaps 1 to 3 tertials and 1 to 2 central tail feather pairs. And so those are both considered the Northern Hemisphere strategy. In the Southern Hemisphere strategy, it's more extensive. So then the preformative molt can be incomplete with all or most body feathers and some but not all flight feathers replaced, or it can be complete, as I mentioned with the pectoral sandpiper and oriental pratincole, with all body and flight feathers replaced. And another distinction, in species that do replace flight feathers, the sequence can be typical from the inside to the out on primaries and the outside in on secondaries, or eccentric, where the molt begins somewhere other than the innermost primary and the outermost secondary. So species that I know of, and I'm sure this is not a complete list, which exhibit a typical replacement pattern include the black-tailed godwits, which I showed you earlier, and the oriental pratincole. This is based on my personal observations, and I'm sure that I will discover more of this, but for now, this is what I know. And species with an eccentric replacement pattern include the redneck stint, curlew sandpiper, pteric sandpiper, marsh sandpiper, and common greenshank. But as I say, it's probably, this is the commonest strategy exhibited by shorebirds in Malaysia. All right, let's move on now to the simple alternate strategy. And if you remember, complex alternate strategy has 2 distinct molts in the first, 2 distinct additional molts in the first cycle. Birds with a simple alternate strategy have only 1 additional molt in the first cycle, which is preformative molt. It tends to start later than birds with CAS, and it tends to last longer. So I've just diagrammed it here. The preformative molt starting somewhere in somewhere on southward migration, but continuing well into and through the northern winter season and into the following spring and even summer. So let's look at that. And there are not so many examples of this. First of all, let's look at grey plover. Grey plover, at least many grey plovers, have this Northern Hemisphere SAS strategy. And we can see that this bird, which was photographed in mid-December, despite the late date, it's hardly begun, or it may not even have begun preformative molt. It's still almost completely or completely in juvenile plumage. So that's a feature of SAS preformative molt, that it tends to start later than complex alternate strategy preformative molt. By late March, there is a limited and slow molt of some scapulars, coverts and tertials. As you can see on this bird, the remainder of the feathers, the juvenile feathers, are pretty worn, and I've just tried to pick out the feathers that have been molted on the diagram shown in pink here. So you can see that the extent of the preformative molt is pretty limited. It's also worth just noticing the aspect or the patterning of these fresh feathers, because on this particular bird they're quite plain and grey. Another bird, which was actually with this one, taken at the same place, at the same date, exactly the same time, and you can see that the coverts and scapulars that have been replaced and tertial are very differently patterned. The extent of the molt is rather similar, but the pattern of the feathers is different, and this probably indicates that they were molted later than the other bird, but it doesn't mean that it's a different molt. It just means that perhaps hormonal levels were different. Perhaps it molted. These are later molted feathers where the bird is in slightly more of a, you could say, breeding condition, although it's not going to breed this in this particular year. But it's thought that the patterning on the feathers is linked to the hormone levels within the bird, rather than it doesn't signify that it's a different molt or a different plumage. Here's a bird that was photographed in May, and you can see that feather replacement is now somewhat more extensive. More scapulars and coverts have been replaced, but still, considering the late date, it's a fairly limited preformative molt. And you can also see on this bird that some of the mantle and upper scapular feathers are darker, but that doesn't mean that it's a separate molt. It just means that these are probably more recently molted feathers in the same preformative molt, which is very protracted. So you've got feathers that may be several months older, but they are not from a different molt. So in order for a bird to have two different molts, the same feather follicle needs to be activated twice. So in this case, there's no indication that that's the case. So this bird is probably still in a protracted preformative molt. So how can we spot these birds that have a simple alternate strategy in the Northern Hemisphere strategy between August and December? And the simple answer is maybe you won't, because they may not begin preformative molt until December or January. So here's a whimbrel photographed in November, and it's still in juvenile plumage. There's no preformative molt. The juvenile plumage is worn, but there's no molt. There's no preformative molt evident yet. And so one of the features of the SAS Northern Hemisphere strategy is this late onset of preformative molt. So what you've got here is a juvenile plumage bird that is looking very worn, and it will get even more worn before preformative molt begins. I should say that as far as I'm aware, most whimbrel follow a Northern Hemisphere strategy, but it may be that not all of them do. So again, whimbrels that spend the northern winter further south may follow a Southern Hemisphere strategy. So how do we spot the simple alternate Northern Hemisphere strategy from December to June? Here's a bird, a grey plover, photographed in April. And you can see that the preformative molt is still very limited. Just a few scapulars, coverts, tertials. It may be a bit more extensive than that, but also you're seeing some very, very worn juvenile coverts and scapulars and tertials here. And as I mentioned earlier, the pattern of the appearance of the formative feathers may be more or less like the breeding plumage aspect, but that will depend on the timing of the timing when the feathers were replaced. Okay, we are now on the final variation, which is the simple alternate strategy, Southern Hemisphere strategy. And for this, I want to use Eurasian curlew as my example. This individual bird spent almost a year on my local beach. When it arrived, it was in largely in juvenile plumage. It may have replaced its scapulars, but all the coverts and the flight feathers were juvenile plumage. And this is not unusual for large shorebirds that don't mature or breed in their second calendar year. They often spend they often oversummer on the non-breeding grounds for their first and second cycles. So in this case, on the 18th of November 2022, this bird was largely in juvenile plumage, but it had begun preformative molt of the scapulars and maybe a couple of inner median coverts, as I've tried to illustrate on the diagram here. A couple of months later, 2.5 months later, it had replaced most of its lesser and median coverts, dropped some of its greater coverts, and started preformative molt of its primaries. So primaries 1 to 3 were fresh, and one of the primary coverts as well. And this was occurring in typical sequence from the innermost primary outwards. And you can see on the photograph where those new primaries are. The outer primary 3 is still growing and is a lot shorter than the surrounding primaries. At the end of May, almost 5 months later, the bird had continued its preformative molt, and we can see on the near wing here that preformative molt has reached primary 8. So the outer 2 primaries are still the old juvenile feathers, and they're now looking quite worn. But the second pre-basic primary molt has begun. So the innermost primary here is actually from second pre-basic molt. And the second primary has been dropped. At the moment, all the secondaries are still old juvenile feathers. The greater coverts have now been replaced, formative plumage, and the median and lesser coverts, which were molted earlier, are a little bit more worn, but they are also in formative plumage. So that was the end of May. By early July, about a month later, we can see that preformative primary molt was continuing, and it has actually reached primary 10. Its primary 10 is still growing. So preformative primary molt was complete, and second pre-basic primary molt was continuing and had reached primary 5. And secondary molt had begun. So it began from the first secondary and also the fifth secondary, and possibly also from the innermost secondary. We can also see that some of the median and lesser coverts are now in second basic plumage. And because the new secondaries were contiguous with the new second pre-basic inner primaries, I considered that the juvenile secondaries were replaced by the second pre-basic molt rather than by preformative molt. So preformative molt did not include the secondaries on this particular bird. And then on the 3rd of October, 3 months after the last photographs, the bird is looking very nice. Second pre-basic molt had reached P7 and probably was being suspended because there's no further molt, even though P7 has reached its full length. So primaries 8 to 10 are still the old formative feathers, but probably the bird will now suspend molt during migration, and then finish off its pre-basic molt, its second pre-basic molt, once it arrives at its wintering ground. It's completed its second pre-basic secondary molt, and also it's replaced all its coverts and scapulars in second pre-basic molt. So this was a very interesting, unique opportunity to watch the progress of molt in one particular bird. This was for most of the time that it was present, it was the only curlew at the site. And I just summarized here, so just a summary of the molt. Well, if we look at these two lines at the bottom here, we can see that active preformative molt was taking place when it arrived in November 2022, and it finished around about June when it reached the outermost primary, and second pre-basic molt began in May and presumably continued through August and September, although I didn't actually photograph it in those months, but it was complete, or at least it had suspended by the time I did photograph it at the beginning of October. So how can we spot simple alternate strategy for formative plumage on birds that pursue a southern hemisphere strategy? Between August and December, again, it's unlikely that we'll see it because they are late molting. So this bird is still in full juvenile plumage, even though it was middle of September. And birds that are using a simple alternate strategy tend to be late beginning their preformative molt. It's unlikely. So if we do see birds in active primary molt before December, they are probably second cycle and above rather than in preformative molt. Beyond December, so into the second calendar year, what we see here is 3 generations of flight feathers, including some juvenile feathers, so juvenile secondaries, formative outer primaries, and second basic innermost primary. So it may be that the secondaries are the last juvenile feathers to be replaced. And so if we can find juvenile feathers still present on the wing when pre-basic molt has begun, then we can say that it's most likely a bird in its second cycle. So which species exhibit the simple alternate strategy? Actually rather few, to my knowledge. They're generally large species which take more than one cycle to reach sexual maturity, so they're not going to breed in their second calendar year. And their molt is usually rather limited and protracted. In the Northern Hemisphere strategy, they don't generally molt any flight feathers. In the Southern Hemisphere strategy, they may molt some or possibly all flight feathers, but it's usually overtaken by second pre-basic molt. So the pre-formative molt is probably not complete because it is overtaken by second pre-basic molt. As far as I know, species that follow a simple alternate strategy, Northern Hemisphere strategy, would include many grey plovers, maybe most, and also many whimbrel, perhaps most. And species with a SAS Southern Hemisphere strategy, well, this particular Eurasian curlew I suspect Far Eastern curlew as well, and possibly also little whimbrel. Well, if you're still watching this video, congratulations. What have we learnt? Hopefully something, and perhaps you'll need to, or you may wish to watch this through again. First of all, we've learned that formative plumage is a once-in-a-lifetime plumage which occurs only in the first cycle. It may be one of two additional plumages in the first cycle, which would be the complex alternate strategy, or it could be the only additional plumage in the first cycle, in which case we would say that the bird is pursuing a simple alternate strategy. The extent of preformative molt depends on the latitude at which the bird spends the non-breeding season, and in most cases good views are needed, and preferably still photographs of open wings are really what we need. If the bird is not in the hand, then good quality photographs of a bird either stretching its wing or flying are needed to be able to determine the state of preformative molt. So that's all for this video. Thanks very much for watching.